I still remember very clearly that rainy night at the end of October, when 3 heavy knocks sounded at the door of my cabin in the Olympic Mountains. I thought it was an injured hiker, so I opened the door immediately. But what stood in front of me made the blood in my body feel as if it had frozen. A giant Bigfoot, its fur soaked with water, its breathing heavy, its eyes red as if it had been crying for hours. The strangest thing was that it did not threaten me at all. It slowly knelt down right on my porch, covered its face with both hands, and let out choked sobs. Then it pressed its hands together, bowed its head, and begged me to follow it into the dark forest to save its family. My name is Margaret Collins, but most people around the Olympic region call me Maggie. This year I am 64 years old. Before retiring, I worked as a veterinarian for nearly 40 years at a clinic in Port Angeles, Washington. After my husband died of a heart attack and my only son moved to the East Coast to build a new life, I decided to leave the busy rhythm of town behind and move into a small cabin in the middle of the Olympic Mountains. I spent most of my time caring for injured animals brought to me by local people or rangers, growing a few beds of medicinal herbs, and enjoying the quiet life of the forest. Back then, I still thought I had seen almost everything nature could bring. I had no idea that the night at the end of October that year would change everything I believed I understood about this world. Before the 3 knocks that changed my life, that afternoon had been as peaceful as any other day. At the end of October that year, long stretches of rain had left the whole forest covered in a thick layer of mist. Every time I opened the door, the wind carried the smell of damp wood and rotting leaves into the cabin. I spent almost the entire day drying herbs, repairing the roof of the shelter for a few rescued goats, and preparing more firewood for the coming winter. Everything was normal until that evening. I had just put away my medicine bag when I suddenly realized the forest had become strangely silent. The owls were gone. The insects that usually chirped around the cabin were no longer making a sound. That stillness made me instinctively look out the window. Outside, there was only a curtain of white rain and rows of trees swaying in the strong wind. I thought perhaps a bear was passing through, so I did not pay too much attention to it. I placed the kettle on the stove, planning to make a cup of tea and go to bed early. At that exact moment, 3 heavy knocks suddenly sounded from the wooden door at the front porch. The sound was slow, strong, and firm enough to make the oil lamp hanging beside the door tremble slightly. The first thought that came to my mind was that some hiker was in trouble because of the storm. I picked up the oil lamp, put on a raincoat, and stepped over to open the door. Only a moment later, everything I thought I understood about the Olympic forest changed forever. Standing in front of me was an adult Bigfoot, its fur soaked through by the rain, its eyes red with desperation, and then that giant creature slowly knelt down right in front of the steps of my cabin. Its breathing came in heavy bursts, thin clouds of white vapor blending into the cold night air. The yellow light from the porch fell across its face, which was covered in droplets of water, and it took me a few seconds to realize it was not only rain. Streams of water rolled from the corners of its eyes down into the fur on its cheeks, forming dark trails that looked different from the rest. It slowly lowered its body in front of the wooden steps leading into the cabin. The movement was very slow, as if it was trying to let me see every action clearly. Its knees touched the ground, and its massive back bent so low that its head was almost level with the porch railing. Then it raised its enormous hands and covered its face. The sounds coming from its throat were deep and broken, more like sobs than anything I had ever heard in the forest. The sight made my heart tighten. I had never imagined I would one day stand only a few steps away from a Bigfoot, and I had never imagined I would witness such a powerful creature showing helplessness so clearly. I suddenly understood that this creature was trying to communicate something very specific. And whatever it was, it mattered enough for it to come to the home of a human in the middle of the night. A series of questions appeared in my mind. If I followed it, would I still have a chance to come back? If there was an entire group of Bigfoots behind that forest, would my trust become the last mistake of my life? I had lived alone in the mountains for many years, so I'd always learned to respect my own instinct for caution. But this time, my intuition whispered something completely different. I did not sense hunting or any intention to gain the upper hand from the creature in front of me. What I saw was the panic of someone racing against time, exactly like the faces of people who had carried their pets into my clinic for many years, always hoping the doctor would say there was still a chance. I took a deep breath and asked quietly, even though I was sure it could not understand every word I said, "Is someone hurt?" The creature immediately lifted its head. It looked straight at me, its eyes widening, then nodded again and again. That almost instant reaction sent chills up my spine. I did not yet know what I was facing, but I knew it had understood the meaning of my question through my voice, my eyes, or my gesture. It pointed toward the forest again, this time more firmly, then looked over at the medical bag still sitting on the chair near the door. Its eyes stayed on the bag for a few seconds before returning to me, as if hoping I would bring what it needed. I turned back into the cabin, my mind still in chaos. I opened the familiar wooden cabinet, took the largest emergency bag, and quickly checked the antibiotics, pain medication, sterile bandages, sutures, temporary splinting tools, and a few bottles of saline solution. I also took another oil lamp because the rain had made the flashlight on the table flicker weakly. As I prepared, I kept asking myself whether I was being too reckless. One wrong decision, and no one would know where I had disappeared in this forest that stretched for hundreds of square miles. My son would call at the end of the weekend as usual, and then slowly realize that his mother was no longer answering. That thought made my hands stop on the strap of the bag. I stood still for a few seconds, looking at the photo of my husband on the shelf beside the fireplace. He once told me that being a veterinarian was not only about healing animals, but also about learning to respect life in every form. I smiled very faintly, as if I could still hear that familiar voice somewhere inside the house. When I returned to the door, the giant creature was still standing in the same place. The moment I slung the medical bag over my shoulder, I saw the change clearly in its eyes. The desperation was still there, but mixed into it was a fragile thread of hope that it had probably tried to hold on to all the way to my cabin. It stepped aside, slowly turned toward the trail leading into the forest, and stopped to wait for me. I locked the cabin door, raised the oil lamp, and stepped down from the wooden porch. From that moment on, I knew I had made a decision that could change the rest of my life. I pulled the collar of my coat higher to block the cold rain whipping against my face and followed the massive figure ahead. The cabin door closed behind me with a dry sound, and from that moment every familiar sound of home seemed to be left behind. In front of me was only the narrow trail cutting through the old Olympic forest, where ancient cedar trunks stood close together like giant pillars holding up the entire night sky. The light from the oil lamp in my hand was only enough to illuminate a small patch of ground in front of my shoes, leaving the rest of the forest buried in thick gray mist. I had walked these paths for years, and yet that night everything felt foreign, as if I had just stepped into a world that had always existed beside ours, but had never opened its door to humans. The Bigfoot kept a careful distance in front of me. It moved quickly, but after every stretch of path, it slowed for a few beats and turned its head to look back. Its eyes did not carry impatience. They looked like the eyes of a guide, making sure its companion could still keep up. I realized it was constantly adjusting its speed to my steps. If it had wanted to, with that body, it could have left me far behind in only a few seconds. Instead, it patiently chose a pace suitable for a woman over 60. That small detail made me begin to feel a little lighter, because its care seemed to come from a desire to bring me safely to the destination rather than force me to follow. The path quickly left the familiar trail and moved deeper into a primal forest where even rangers rarely set foot. We continued across slopes covered with rotting leaves. The rain gradually became lighter, but the mist grew so thick that many times I could only see the blurred back of the creature ahead. Whenever the distance between us grew because of rough ground, it stopped on higher ground and looked down as a sign that I only needed to keep walking toward it. I had never thought I would feel reassured while following a creature that most folks' stories described as a frightening mystery. Yet throughout that journey, what I felt most clearly was the urgency of someone trying to bring a doctor to a patient before it was too late. After nearly an hour of crossing forests that had never appeared on any map I knew, The Bigfoot suddenly slowed down. It raised one hand to signal for me to stop, then looked toward a rock wall covered in green moss, where hanging fern branches concealed a narrow opening almost completely blended into the surroundings. The creature took a deep breath, turned to me with eyes filled with both hope and worry, then slowly stepped through the curtain of leaves into the darkness behind the rock wall. I tightened my grip on the medical bag, raised the oil lamp higher, and quietly followed, completely unprepared for the scene waiting inside. I bent down and passed through the narrow rock opening, carefully keeping the oil lamp from hitting the jagged stones on both sides. The deeper I went, the softer the sound of rain outside became, giving way to the heavy atmosphere of an enclosed space where only the dripping of water from the cave ceiling echoed against the stone floor. The yellow flame swayed with each step, slowly pushing back the darkness ahead. Only a few seconds later, I saw a large, fallen tree blocking the far end of the cave, and just behind that tree was a sight that made me stop in place. A female Bigfoot was leaning against the rock wall. Her entire body shifted to one side because her right arm was pinned tightly between the fallen tree and a large stone. Her forearm was swollen unnaturally, and the fur around the injury was matted with dried blood and mud. One look was enough for me to know that the injury had lasted for several days and that infection was spreading fast. Right beside the mother were two young Bigfoots. The older one looked about 8 years old and the younger one about 5. Both clung tightly to their mother's uninjured shoulder, as if letting go would make her disappear. Their eyes kept moving from their mother's face to me, filled with worry and caution. I had seen that look in many young animals when their mothers were hurt, so the feeling of strangeness inside me softened. The instincts of children, no matter what species they belonged to, seemed to be the same when facing the risk of losing the one they loved most. The male Bigfoot slowly moved to his mate's side and knelt beside her. He gently stroked the fur on her forehead and touched her hand that could still move, as if trying to give her a little calm. The female Bigfoot opened her eyes and looked at him. Her breathing became faster from the pain, but she still tried to tilt her head very slightly, as if responding to that familiar presence. I realized there was an understanding between them that needed no words. That exact moment made me forget that I was standing before beings most of the world still considered legends. I took a deep breath and moved closer, kneeling beside the trapped arm. Just touching the skin around the wound was enough for me to feel the abnormal heat of infection. I studied the position of the tree trunk and the angle of the rock, then quickly understood that every medicine in my bag would be useless if that arm remained pinned for a few more hours. I looked up at the male Bigfoot. He was looking at me with eyes full of expectation. I pointed at the tree trunk and shook my head, then placed my hand on the mother's arm and looked straight at him. In one brief moment, I felt that he understood exactly what I was trying to say. He slowly stood, walked to the massive tree trunk, then looked back at me one final time, as if waiting for a signal to spend every bit of strength he had left for the chance to save the woman he loved. I placed the medical bag on the stone floor and moved the oil lamp closer so I could examine the injured arm carefully. In my many years as a veterinarian, I had treated countless injuries caused by fallen trees, rolling rocks, and accidents in the woods. So with only a quick look, I knew the situation in front of me was far more serious than I had hoped while walking there. The female Bigfoot's right forearm was trapped between the tree trunk and a large stone in a very bad position. The soft tissue had swollen so much that the fur around it was pulled tight, and the exposed skin between patches of fur had turned dark purple, mixed with abnormal red streaks. I gently placed my fingertips on the part of the arm above the wound to check it. The body temperature in that area was much hotter than the surrounding tissue, a clear sign that the infection had already begun to spread. I carefully lifted the trapped hand slightly to test the reflexes. The fingers barely moved. Only one fingertip curled weakly after a few seconds. I looked at the female Bigfoot. She was biting her lower lip tightly, each heavy breath echoing through the quiet cave. Just by looking into her eyes, I knew she could still feel the pain, but the forearm had already begun losing function. That meant the nerves and blood vessels had been compressed for too long. If this continued, the chance of saving the arm would be almost gone. I leaned closer to observe the gap between the tree trunk and the rock. Part of the bone near the wrist seemed to have shifted out of its normal position. There was not much bleeding anymore because the pressure of the tree had accidentally created a giant tourniquet, but that was only a temporary silence. As soon as the arm was released, blood could rush out quickly. I began picturing every step I would have to take afterward, from controlling the bleeding, cleaning the wound, and checking the fracture to temporarily stabilizing the arm. Everything would have to happen continuously because a delay of only a few minutes could send the mother in front of me into shock from blood loss or a worsening infection. The two young Bigfoots were still sitting close to their mother. The older one had an arm around her shoulder while the younger one held her left hand tightly with both tiny hands. They kept looking into my face as if waiting for something. Though they had never interacted with humans, they seemed to understand that I was their family's last chance. That feeling made my throat tighten. In that moment, I no longer saw the mysterious creatures people whispered about in stories around campfires. In front of me, there was simply an injured mother, two frightened children, and a husband who had traveled far through a rainy night to find anyone who could save his mate. I sat upright, took a deep breath to keep my mind clear, then looked toward the male Bigfoot. He was still standing beside the tree trunk, his eyes never leaving me since I had started examining the wound. I pointed to the trapped arm, then placed both hands on the tree trunk and made a lifting motion with all my strength. Next, I slowly shook my head, signaling that I was not strong enough to do that alone. The male Bigfoot watched each gesture, then shifted his eyes to the trunk, pressing down on his wife's arm. I saw his chest rising and falling more strongly. A few seconds later, he nodded slightly, stepped close to the trunk, and placed both huge hands on the soaked bark, preparing for an effort that his entire family had placed all their hope into. The male Bigfoot crouched low, planted both feet firmly on the stone floor, and tightened his hands around the massive tree trunk. I could see every band of muscle under the thick fur tense with each breath. Before beginning, he turned and looked at his mate for a long time. The female Bigfoot nodded faintly, her eyes still fixed on him with absolute trust. I had never heard them speak a single word to each other, but that look contained more than any language I had ever known. The two young Bigfoots immediately held their mother more tightly. The older one gently stroked her shoulder, while the younger one pressed its forehead to her uninjured arm, as if trying to give her courage. I opened the bandages, placed scissors, saline, and a tourniquet beside my knee, and tried to arrange everything in the exact order I would need it. In my head, I kept repeating every step, because the chance would only last a few short seconds. I looked at the male Bigfoot and raised my hand as a signal. He nodded slightly. One deep breath sounded through the stillness of the cave, and then his entire massive body pushed its strength into his arms. At first, the tree trunk barely moved. Pieces of rotten bark fell to the ground as the pressure increased. I could clearly hear the heavy sound of wood grinding against stone. Little by little, the trunk began to shift. The gap between the tree and the rock opened slowly, just wide enough for light from the oil lamp to slip in. The male Bigfoot's face turned red from the strain. Drops of water from the fur on his forehead kept falling onto the stone floor. His arms shook violently as he held up that enormous weight. "Good. Hold it right there," I said as I rushed to the trapped arm, even though I knew he did not understand every word. Perhaps what he understood was in the speed of my movements and the urgency clear on my face. I slid both hands under the female Bigfoot's forearm. The flesh had been compressed for days, leaving the arm almost stuck to the mud and splinters of wood. I had to carefully loosen it bit by bit to avoid tearing the already damaged tissue further. As soon as the pressure from the trunk eased, the trapped blood began to flow again. A dark red streak quickly spread across the stone floor. The female Bigfoot clenched her teeth, her entire body tightening as the sudden pain struck. Her breathing became rapid, and deep groans echoed through the cave, making the two young Bigfoots panic and cling to their mother even harder. I forced myself to stay calm and used all my strength to pull the injured arm out from the gap. Only a very short section remained, but the displaced bone kept the arm caught. I changed the angle, lifted the elbow slightly, and turned the wrist in the opposite direction. With one firm pull, the arm was finally freed completely. Almost at the same moment, I shouted for the male Bigfoot to lower the tree. Though we shared no language, he immediately understood from my movement. The tree trunk crashed back onto the stone with a heavy impact, making the entire cave tremble slightly. The male Bigfoot stepped back several paces, his arms hanging from exhaustion. He bent over, bracing both hands on his knees, his chest rising and falling violently after the effort. I had no time to watch him. Blood began flowing from the wound exactly as I had predicted. I pressed several layers of gauze tightly over the forearm while the female Bigfoot shook from pain. The younger Bigfoot made choked sounds and tried to touch its mother's hand. The older one quickly pulled the younger back a few steps, though it could not take its eyes off the blood-soaked arm. They looked at me with such worry that my heart felt squeezed. I had seen many young animals frightened when their mothers were in danger, but this was the first time I had felt so clearly the helplessness of a family standing on the line between life and death. The male Bigfoot quickly knelt beside his wife. He gently lifted her head against his chest, and with his other hand, slowly stroked the top of her head in a steady rhythm. The gesture was familiar to me. Many years earlier, whenever I was badly sick, my husband would often sit beside me and stroke my hair like that. It was not something that could make the pain disappear, but it was enough to let the ones suffering know they were not alone. The female Bigfoot tilted her head and leaned closer against her mate's shoulder. Her eyes were still full of pain, but she seemed calmer once she felt her husband beside her. While I continued holding pressure on the wound, the female Bigfoot suddenly squeezed her left hand tightly around the male Bigfoot's arm. The grip was so strong that the thick fur on his forearm pressed flat against his skin, but he held still, letting his mate cling to him as a way of enduring the pain. The sight left me silent for a few seconds. In the cold cave, I no longer saw the difference between them and humans. I only saw a husband willing to share every painful moment with his wife, and two children standing close together with red eyes full of fear. When the bleeding began to slow under the pressure of the gauze, I finally let out a long breath. The hardest stage had just ended, but I understood the real battle had only begun. The arm had been freed, but the infection, fracture, and soft tissue damage were still there in front of us. I looked up at the whole family. The male Bigfoot looked back at me, his eyes still tense, but for the first time since I met him, I saw a clearer spark of hope there. Perhaps, after several days of waiting and desperation, that family finally believed the mother still had a chance to return to normal life. I replaced the first layer of gauze, now soaked red, with a fresh layer and opened a bottle of saline, slowly rinsing away the soil, sand, and small wood fragments still clinging inside the wound. The clear liquid ran over the swollen purple skin, carrying away dried blood and mud that had built up for days. The female Bigfoot flinched each time the water touched the crushed flesh, but she tried to keep her arm still so I could work. I watched carefully and tried to assess the damage to each layer of tissue. Some areas of skin had begun changing color from being compressed for too long, but the upper muscle still responded fairly well when I checked it. That gave me a little hope that this arm still had a chance to recover if the infection could be controlled in time. I used scissors to trim the fur around the wound so I could see more clearly. It was a task I had performed countless times in my clinic, but this time it was happening in a freezing cave under the flickering light of an oil lamp, while an entire Bigfoot family watched anxiously. The older child sat close beside the father, hardly blinking. The younger one leaned into its sibling, sometimes looking at its mother and then at me as if wanting to know whether things were getting better yet. Whenever the female Bigfoot frowned from pain, the two children unconsciously held each other tighter. Those reactions reminded me of many families who had once sat outside my veterinary emergency room, where children always held their parents' hands while waiting for news about their four-legged friend. Worry for someone we love seems to carry the same shape everywhere. After cleaning the wound, I took the antiseptic solution and gently dabbed it across each torn area of skin. The female Bigfoot shuddered slightly, her breathing becoming faster as the burning sensation spread through her arm. The male Bigfoot immediately sat closer, wrapping one arm behind his wife's back to give her support. His other hand slowly moved from the top of her head down to her shoulder in a steady rhythm, as if reminding her that he was still there. The mother turned her head slightly and leaned against her husband's shoulder, closing her eyes for a few seconds to regain calm before I continued working on the displaced bone. This was the part that worried me most. I placed both hands on the injured forearm, feeling the position of the bone ends and calculating the proper direction to set them. If I did it wrong, the damage would become much worse. I looked at the female Bigfoot and nodded slightly as a warning. She seemed to understand because she took a deep breath and gripped her husband's arm tightly. I focused every bit of attention on my hands, slowly pulled the forearm along its axis, and adjusted the angle of the displaced bone. A small, dull click sounded when the bone moved back close to its correct position. The female Bigfoot's whole body stiffened from the pain, her fingers digging into the male Bigfoot's arm so hard that the thick fur was pressed flat. That enormous creature sat still, his eyes never leaving his wife's face. He placed his other hand gently on her forehead, as if wishing he could share some of the pain she was carrying. I used the chance to temporarily stabilize the bone, then quickly sutured the largest tears to reduce the risk of infection spreading. Each needle passing through the thick skin required more force than normal, but the female Bigfoot endured it with incredible strength. Sometimes she frowned slightly and breathed in deeply, then tried to hold her arm still so I could finish each stitch. I had never met a patient with such astonishing endurance. Perhaps it was survival instinct, or perhaps love for the two children sitting right beside her, that helped her overcome pain that seemed almost impossible to bear. When the tears had been closed, I took 2 splints from my medical bag and placed them along the forearm. The splints had been designed for large breed dogs, so they were quite small compared to a Bigfoot's arm. I had to add several straight pieces of wood found inside the cave, wrap them with clean gauze, and secure everything with multiple layers of bandage. The male Bigfoot watched every movement closely. Whenever I needed another piece of wood or clean cloth, I only had to glance over, and he quickly understood and brought me exactly what I needed. That natural cooperation made the work much easier, as if we had worked together before. Finally, I took the only injectable antibiotic vial I had brought and carefully considered the dosage. I did not know exactly how a Bigfoot's body would react to the medicine, but if I skipped this step, the risk of sepsis would be very high. After a few seconds of thought, I decided to use a lower than normal dose and chose an injection site on her healthy shoulder. The female Bigfoot only flinched slightly when the needle touched her skin, then quickly became calm again. I packed up the tools, wiped the blood from my hands, and sat back to observe the whole situation one final time. The arm was still very swollen, and the mother's face still showed clear exhaustion, but her breathing was steadier than before. The 2 young Bigfoots immediately moved in to hug their mother very gently, while the male Bigfoot lowered his head and looked at me for a long time. In those eyes, I no longer saw the panic from when he had stood on my porch. Instead, I saw the sincere gratitude of a husband who had just seen hope return to his family. I sat quietly for several more minutes to monitor the female Bigfoot's condition before closing the medical bag. Her breathing was more stable, and the color of her face was less pale than when I had first entered the cave. Still, my years of experience made me understand clearly that what I had just done only helped her survive the most immediate danger. The damaged bone still needed close monitoring. The wound had to be dressed regularly, and the infection had to be controlled with medication over several days. One treatment in the middle of a rainy night like this would not be enough to return that arm to normal. I looked at the medical bag, now almost half empty, and sighed softly. The medicines I always kept in the cabin were still plentiful, especially antibiotics, anti-inflammatory drugs, and clean dressing supplies. If I wanted to save this mother, I had to return. I turned to the male Bigfoot, slowly opened the medical bag, and placed the nearly empty antibiotic vial in my palm. Then I pointed at the vial and then at his wife's bandaged arm. I repeated the motion several times, trying to express the idea with the simplest gestures possible. Next, I pointed toward the cave entrance, then turned and pointed in the direction we had come from. Finally, I placed my hand on my chest, pointed back to the medical bag, and nodded gently. I did not know whether I was explaining clearly enough, but it was all I could do when we shared no spoken language. The male Bigfoot studied each movement carefully. He looked down at the vial in my hand for a long time, then looked toward his mate's arm. After a few seconds of thought, he lifted his eyes and looked straight at me. His gaze held the same calm I had gradually become familiar with since entering the cave. He nodded once, then placed his large hand on his own chest before slowly turning toward the exit. The gesture was simple, but so clear that I felt we had just completed a conversation without needing a single word. I believed he understood that I would return, and he would continue caring for his wife while waiting. I stood, checked the bandage on the female Bigfoot's arm one last time, and pulled the hide blanket over her more securely to keep her warm. Before walking away, I gently placed my hand on the male Bigfoot's shoulder as reassurance. He looked at my hand for a moment and lowered his head slightly. It was the third bow I had received from this creature since meeting him, but this time the meaning was very different. The first had been a desperate plea for help. The second had been gratitude after the arm was freed. This time, I felt trust. He trusted that I would return, and I also trusted that I had just made the right decision. As I carried the oil lamp toward the cave entrance, I could still feel the eyes of the entire family following me from behind, and only one thought remained in my heart. I had to return before sunset the next day because deep inside this forest, a family had placed all its hope in my silent promise. The next morning, I woke very early while mist still covered the pines behind my cabin. I had barely slept the night before. The image of the female Bigfoot's swollen purple arm and the hopeful eyes of her husband when I left the cave kept returning to my mind. After quickly making a cup of coffee, I opened the medicine cabinet and packed more sterile bandages, antibiotics, anti-inflammatory medication, antiseptic solution, several larger splints, and some high-energy food in case they needed it. I checked each item carefully, because I understood that every trip into that forest now carried more responsibility than any house call I had ever made. When I locked the cabin door and stepped onto the trail, I still did not know whether I could find the cave entrance again. The vast Olympic forest could swallow every trace after a single night of rain. But after walking only a few hundred steps, I saw a familiar figure standing silently beneath an ancient cedar. The male Bigfoot was already there. His fur was still damp with morning mist, but his face no longer held the panic I had seen on the first night. He stood still and looked at me, then slowly lowered his eyes to the medical bag on my shoulder. In that moment, I felt as if both of us exhaled in relief. I had kept my promise to return, and he had also trusted that placing hope in a human had not been a mistake. Without any further gesture, the male Bigfoot turned and stepped onto the path leading deep into the forest. I quietly followed, and this time, between us, there was something more valuable than curiosity or caution. It was trust, formed after one night of working together to hold on to a mother's life. From that day on, going to the cave deep in the Olympic forest gradually became part of my daily rhythm. Every morning after feeding the animals being cared for at my cabin, I prepared the medicine bag, replaced fresh bandages, added antibiotics, and brought soft food in case the mother needed more nutrition during recovery. At some point, I no longer wondered whether the male Bigfoot would appear. Every morning, when I reached the large cedar near the old trail, he was already standing there waiting. Some days the forest was covered in fog. Some days a thin drizzle had been falling since dawn. But that tall figure still appeared at the place we had silently chosen as our meeting point. Each time he saw me, he tilted his head slightly like a familiar greeting, then silently led the way deeper into the forest. The trips became less tense than they had been on the first night. I grew used to the uneven ground, the sound of water running through the rocks, and the narrow paths barely wide enough for one person between the ferns. The male Bigfoot still walked a few steps ahead, but the distance between us grew smaller each day. On steep sections, he slowed down so I could keep up more easily. When large fallen trees blocked the way after strong winds, he only lifted them aside and continued walking as if it were nothing. More than once, I smiled to myself at the strange contrast. A creature with strength humans could hardly imagine always chose the gentlest gestures whenever he was near me. As soon as we entered the cave, the two young Bigfoots were almost always the first to notice me. In the beginning, they only stayed close to their mother and watched me with cautious eyes. Whenever I moved closer, they stepped back a little but kept watching every movement carefully. I understood that completely. If a stranger suddenly appeared in your home to touch your injured mother, any child would feel uneasy. So I never tried to approach them first. I always spent the first few minutes speaking softly to the female Bigfoot in a calm tone, even though she could not understand each sentence. Then I opened the medicine bag, changed the bandage, and checked the wound as part of a familiar routine. I realized that this steady rhythm slowly helped the two children feel safer. Day by day, the distance between us began to change naturally. While I prepared the gauze, the older Bigfoot child would sit closer to watch. Its eyes carefully followed every step as I cleaned the wound, mixed medicine, and wrapped the bandage. One time, I accidentally dropped a roll of bandage onto the stone floor. Before I could bend down to pick it up, the child quickly came forward, carefully picked up the roll, and placed it back beside the medical bag. After doing so, it immediately stepped back to its old position, its eyes still a little cautious, as if waiting to see whether its action had upset me. I smiled, nodded gently, and said thank you out of habit. Maybe it did not understand the meaning of the words, but its face relaxed slightly, as if it could feel the satisfaction in my voice. After about 2 weeks of treatment, I realized that a very special form of communication had formed between me and the Bigfoot family. We had never exchanged language, but every passing day felt like we were learning a new kind of speech made from eyes, gestures, and repeated habits. As a veterinarian, I was already used to reading the body language of animals. A dog lowering its ears in fear, a horse tilting its head in curiosity, or an owl closing its eyes in pain all sent very clear messages if the person watching took enough time to notice. What surprised me was that the Bigfoot family expressed emotions far more richly. Just by watching the way they stood, the way they looked at each other, or the way a hand moved slightly, I could guess what they were thinking with astonishing accuracy. Whenever I entered the cave, the male Bigfoot always cleared a space beside his wife so I could place the medical bag. At first, I thought it was coincidence, but it happened exactly the same way every day. One morning, I smiled, pointed to the bag, and then pointed to the clean patch of stone in front of me. Immediately, he understood, stepped over, picked up a few dry branches left on the ground, and placed them neatly to the side before looking back at me. I nodded gently as a thank you. From that day on, whenever he saw me appear, the first thing he did was prepare a place for me to work. Gradually, that action became a familiar part of every meeting. The two young Bigfoots also began learning very quickly through observation. The older one paid special attention to how I used each item in the medical bag. Once, I reached toward the roll of bandage while still busy holding the mother's arm. It immediately picked up the exact roll I needed and held it out in front of me. I was surprised because I had not pointed to it. Perhaps after many days of watching, it had remembered which item usually came after each step of treatment. I smiled, accepted it, and gently said, "Thank you." The child tilted its head and looked at me for a few seconds. Then its eyes lit up as if it understood that it had helped in a useful way. The younger sibling chose a different way to show care. It loved watching my hands. While I changed its mother's bandage, its eyes always followed every slow motion as I cleaned the wound, adjusted the splint, and wrapped each new layer of bandage. I also gradually learned their signals. Whenever the female Bigfoot felt more pain in her arm than usual, she lightly touched 2 fingers to her shoulder and looked at me. When the pain eased, she usually relaxed her hand and nodded slightly. Every time the male Bigfoot found a more comfortable sitting position for his wife, he looked toward me as if asking whether that position was right. I would answer with a nod or gently adjust a few centimeters so the arm could be raised higher. Those exchanges became so natural that sometimes I forgot we had never understood a single spoken word from one another. The more time I spent in that cave, the more I felt I was witnessing the life of a very ordinary family, except that they had enormous bodies and lived deep in a forest where humans rarely stepped. Everything happening before my eyes each day was so simple that if their thick fur were replaced by human clothing, perhaps no one would notice the difference. Those small things were what truly changed the way I looked at Bigfoot. I no longer thought of old stories or mysterious footprints that newspapers once mentioned. In my eyes, they slowly became a family trying to survive the hardest time of their lives. After the mother was injured, most of the responsibility for caring for the family fell on the male Bigfoot's shoulders. Every morning when I arrived, he had usually just returned from searching for food, since before the sky was fully light. On his shoulders or in his arms were all kinds of berries, forest mushrooms, roots, and sometimes fresh salmon. What caught my attention was not the amount of food he brought, but the way he divided it. He always placed everything, on the stone floor in front of his wife, then used his hand to push most of the food toward her and the two children. Only after making sure all three had started eating did he take the remaining portion for himself. On days when there was very little food, I saw him eat only a few small pieces, then sit quietly and watch his wife and children eat. That look reminded me of my husband years ago. Whenever our family went camping, he always found a way to place the best piece of meat on my plate and our son's, while smiling and saying he never ate much anyway. When I was young, I thought it was only a habit. It took many years for me to understand that sometimes love is simply wanting others to be full before yourself. That day, after changing the bandage and checking the female Bigfoot's arm again, I noticed the swelling had gone down a little. The wound was still very serious, but the color of the skin around the torn edges was brighter than it had been during the first days, a sign that her body was beginning to respond well to treatment. I carefully packed each tool into the medical bag as usual, then stood to prepare to leave. The male Bigfoot walked me close to the cave entrance, while the two children stayed beside their mother. Everything was so normal that I thought it would only be another treatment visit like all the others. When I had only taken a few steps outside the cave, small feet suddenly ran over the stone behind me. I turned and saw the older Bigfoot child holding a bundle of wildflowers in its arms. The flowers were not neatly arranged like in a flower shop down in town. They were tied together with a thin vine, the stems different lengths, some petals still marked with bits of soil and rainwater. One glance was enough for me to know someone had gathered each flower from the forest by hand, and patiently tied them together with all the skill a child could have. It stopped about an arm's length away from me. Its eyes still held a little hesitation, but this time there was far less caution than before. It bowed slightly, placed the flower bundle on a flat stone beside the path, and stepped back a few paces. Then it looked up at me with nervous expectation. I stood silently for a few seconds, feeling as if something had gently touched the softest place in my heart. In all my years as a veterinarian, I had received many thank yous, handwritten cards, and cakes brought in by pet owners. But no gift had ever moved me as much as that awkward little bouquet. I slowly bent down and picked up the flowers. The faint scent of the wild blossoms mixed with the smell of damp leaves after the rain, and I smiled without meaning to. I placed my hand on my chest, then nodded gently toward the older Bigfoot child, the way I had learned to show gratitude to their family. Its face immediately brightened. The younger sibling behind it also laughed in chirping sounds and gently patted its sibling's arm with pride. The female Bigfoot looked at her children with tender eyes, while the male Bigfoot quietly watched everything and bowed his head slightly toward me. I carefully held the flowers against my chest, feeling that I had just received the most beautiful gift since the day I moved into the Olympic forest. What made those flowers precious had never been the petals themselves, but the fact that a child had chosen to express gratitude with all the sincerity it had. That evening, when I returned to the cabin, I placed the wildflowers on the wooden table by the window and sat quietly for a long time with a steaming cup of tea. The house was as silent as every other day, but inside my heart there was a warmth different from any evening before. The grateful eyes of the two Bigfoot children kept appearing in my mind, together with the image of the father standing silently behind them, and the mother smiling as she watched her children. I suddenly realized that I had begun looking forward to my trips into the forest each morning, not only because of my responsibility as a veterinarian, but because I truly wanted to know how that family would be that day. I took an old glass vase my husband had once used for wildflowers every spring, carefully filled it with water, and gently placed each flower inside. A few rain droplets still clung to the petals, trembling slightly under the yellow light in the small kitchen. I smiled as I looked at the bouquet because it reminded me of many beautiful things I had thought remained only in memory. Maybe after my husband died and my son moved to the East Coast. I had become so used to living alone that I had forgotten what it felt like to be waited for or remembered by someone. That night, before going to bed, I prepared the medical bag for the next day, adding more medicine, clean bandages, and some soft food for the female Bigfoot. Every movement felt natural, as if I were preparing to visit a family I had known for years. When I turned off the last light in the cabin, I glanced at the vase on the windowsill. A very clear belief appeared in my heart. The mother's arm would recover day by day, and the bond between me and the Bigfoot family would continue growing through simple, sincere, and steady gestures, just like the Olympic forest had silently nurtured all of us. About 3 weeks after the first day I stepped into the cave, the female Bigfoot's condition began to improve clearly. The moment I removed the old bandage, I noticed that the damaged tissue was no longer stretched tight with swelling. The color of the skin around the wound was gradually becoming more natural. The fluid drainage had reduced significantly, and the smell of infection had almost disappeared completely. Those were the signs any veterinarian hoped to see after a severe injury. I gently checked each area around the forearm and smiled softly. The mother saw my expression and looked toward her husband. The male Bigfoot watched me carefully too, as if trying to read every small change on my face to know how his wife was doing. I raised my thumb with a clear smile. That simple gesture was enough for the whole family to understand that things were moving in a good direction. After changing the bandage, I decided to try a step I had not dared to do for many days. I placed my hand under the female Bigfoot's elbow and slowly gestured for her to try moving her fingers. At first, she looked at me with hesitation. Perhaps she still remembered the sharp pain from the early times she had tried to move the arm. I nodded gently, then placed my other hand over my own fingers and slowly curled and opened them several times to demonstrate. The female Bigfoot watched closely. After a few seconds, she took a deep breath and concentrated completely on the injured hand. The thumb trembled first. The movement was very small, almost impossible to notice unless one watched carefully. I immediately smiled and continued encouraging her with my eyes. Then the index finger slowly bent a little. The rest of the hand was still stiff from weeks of immobility, but just those 2 small movements made my heart beat faster. The male Bigfoot, who had been sitting beside her, suddenly moved closer, his eyes wide with amazement. The 2 young Bigfoots also immediately crawled nearer to their mother. The younger one stared at the trembling hand, while the older one clasped both hands together in nervous excitement. I continued guiding each step slowly. Every time the female Bigfoot could move a little more, I repeated the movement with my own hand so she could imitate it more easily. The movements were still stiff and imprecise, but the most important thing was that the nervous system had begun responding again. After a few minutes of effort, the mother was so tired that she had to lean fully against her husband's shoulder to rest. Small drops of sweat appeared on her forehead, even though the air in the cave was cold. I understood that feeling. After a long period of immobility, learning to control each finger again is always far more difficult than enduring pain during treatment. What surprised me most came from the 2 young Bigfoots. Perhaps they had watched very carefully what I had just done. When they saw their mother resting, the older child raised its own hand in front of its face and slowly curled each finger exactly like the movement I had shown. The younger one looked at its sibling for a few seconds, then copied the movement too. Both turned to look at their mother with hopeful eyes. The female Bigfoot let out a soft, low laugh, then tried to follow her children. The scene made my throat tighten. The 2 children were turning rehabilitation exercises into a small game, so their mother would feel less pressure. No one had ever taught them physical therapy or rehabilitation medicine, but their instinctive love had helped them find a way to encourage their mother. From that day on, every time I came to the cave, the first thing we did after changing the bandage was spend time on simple movement exercises. I gently lifted the wrist, guided elbow bending within a safe range, then let the mother practice each small movement on her own. The two young Bigfoots always sat across from her, raising their hands to demonstrate, like the most devoted assistants I had ever had. Whenever the mother completed a movement, they made happy sounds and lightly clapped their hands together. The male Bigfoot still sat quietly behind her, but many times I caught his eyes shining with hope that grew clearer each day. At the end of that visit, before I packed the medical bag, the female Bigfoot unexpectedly lifted the injured arm a very small distance off her lap and held it there for a few seconds. The movement was still weak and unsteady, but she had done it completely on her own. I looked at that arm, then at the entire family watching closely. In that moment, the whole cave seemed to brighten with the simple joy of its 4 members. I understood that the path to recovery was still long, but the hardest part had been left behind. More importantly, that mother no longer had to walk that path alone, because beside her were a patient husband, 2 loving children, and a doctor who had come to see this special family as an indispensable part of her own life. The following weeks passed with a steady rhythm that I gradually came to cherish. Every morning, after finishing my work at the cabin, I carried the medical bag into the forest. Every evening when I returned, I felt a little lighter inside, because I had seen the mother take one more step on her recovery journey. What made me happiest was not the speed of the wound healing, but the fact that the female Bigfoot began regaining confidence. In the beginning, whenever I guided a new movement, she would look at me for a long time, as if making sure she was capable of doing it. After many successes, that look slowly changed. She began trying movements on her own even before I signaled, then turned to me with an expectant look like a patient wanting to know whether she had done it correctly. Each time I smiled and nodded, a gentle smile appeared on her face too, making the space inside the cave feel warmer. I began gradually increasing the difficulty of the rehabilitation exercises. At first, it was only bending and straightening each finger. Then we moved to flexing the wrist and slowly lifting the forearm. Each movement was performed very slowly to avoid causing more damage. I always demonstrated first with my own arm, then let the female Bigfoot copy me. What was interesting was that the 2 young Bigfoots always joined their mother. The older one performed each movement very seriously, while the younger one was often a beat slower because it kept looking at its mother before following along. Sometimes all 3 raised their arms with identical movements, and the scene made me feel as if I were leading a small class in the middle of the forest rather than treating a Bigfoot family. The male Bigfoot still played his quiet role, just as he had from the first days. During the exercises, he always sat close by, ready to support his wife if she lost her balance. Whenever the mother grew tired, he reached one arm behind her back so she could lean on him and rest for a few minutes. One day, I brought a smooth piece of wood for the mother to practice gripping. The male Bigfoot watched closely as I used it. The next day, when I returned, several other pieces of wood in different sizes had appeared in front of the mother. Clearly, he had spent time searching for and choosing pieces of branches that suited his wife's practice. That small detail made me smile for a long time. Love is sometimes not found in grand gestures, but in observation and quiet efforts like that. About a month after the accident, the mother could hold a leaf bowl filled with water by herself without my support. It was a very simple movement, but the whole family celebrated it as if they had just witnessed a miracle. The 2 young Bigfoots immediately ran to sit beside their mother. The younger one clapped its hands with excitement, while the older one smiled brightly and gently touched the arm that had become less swollen. The male Bigfoot stood behind them, quietly watching with eyes full of pride. I also felt my throat tighten. In my many years of work, I had witnessed many successful recoveries, but few moments had moved me as much as that one, because what was healing in front of me was not only an arm that had once been in danger of permanent disability, but the hope of an entire family that had patiently endured its hardest days together with love, trust, and resilience that never gave up. Nearly 2 months after, the first day I stepped into the cave, I decided to remove the splint completely to check the arm's mobility. I had waited a long time for this moment because if I rushed even a little, all the effort the family had made over many weeks could be affected. When the final layer of bandage came off, the skin around the arm still held a few red scars, but the swelling had almost completely gone down. I gently placed my hand on the female Bigfoot's elbow and guided her to bend and stretch a little, as we had done before. The elbow joint was still somewhat stiff, but the movement was much smoother. I smiled at her and stepped back, signaling for her to try lifting the entire arm by herself without support. The female Bigfoot took a deep breath. I could see the concentration clearly in her eyes. Her healthy hand rested lightly on her knee, while the arm that had once been crushed slowly lifted from its resting position. At first, the movement was very slow. The muscles were still weak after weeks of near immobility. Every centimeter rose through astonishing persistence. The male Bigfoot sat close beside her, and the 2 children knelt in front of her. All 3 seemed to hold their breath as they watched every tiny movement. I also unconsciously tightened my hands together from nervousness. Finally, that arm rose to shoulder height. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was the result of nearly 2 months of treatment, practice, and constant effort. I had not even had time to speak before the 2 young Bigfoots burst into excited sounds and ran to hug their mother. The mother laughed in a deep, warm voice and carefully wrapped the newly raised arm around both children. The movement was still a little stiff, and the embrace was not as strong as with her other arm, but it was enough to hold both children fully against her chest. The younger child immediately rubbed its head into her shoulder, while the older one closed its eyes, as if savoring a moment it had waited for over many weeks. I stood still and watched, my eyes stinging. Throughout the treatment process, what had weighed on me most was not only how much pain the mother endured, but each time I saw her wanting to hold her children and being able to use only one arm. Children always seek their mother's arms as the safest place in the world. Now those arms had returned. Though she would still need more time to fully recover, the mother could finally hold her children with both her love and her own strength. The male Bigfoot remained sitting where he was. He quietly watched his wife and children for a long time. I saw his chest rise and fall slowly. After a few seconds, he turned his face toward the cave entrance as if trying to hide his emotions. When the light from outside fell across his face at an angle, I noticed a thin layer of moisture shining at the corners of his eyes. That image brought me back to the first night, when he had knelt on my cabin porch in the cold rain, covering his face with both hands, while choking out his plea for help. Only 2 months had passed, but his eyes today were completely different. The desperation of that night had been replaced by the relief of someone who had managed to keep his family. I stepped closer and gently placed my hand on the male Bigfoot's arm. He turned to look at me. No further gesture was needed. Both of us understood what had just happened. This was no longer simply the success of a treatment. It was the result of the trust we had given each other from the first moment we met. If he had not been brave enough to come to my cabin that night, the mother might not have had a chance. If I had let fear defeat compassion that night, this family would have faced a very different ending. Before I packed my tools, the female Bigfoot unexpectedly stepped closer. She slowly lifted the arm that had recovered and gently placed that hand on my shoulder. The movement was still not fully flexible, but it was steady enough to send the warmth of that broad palm into me. She looked straight into my eyes and nodded softly. I smiled in return, feeling that every thank you in the world had become unnecessary before that moment. Sometimes, the deepest gratitude only needs to be sent through a peaceful gaze. a hand that was once thought never to move again, and an embrace given to loved ones after a long time when hope had seemed lost. After the day, the female Bigfoot could lift her arm and hold her children. The atmosphere in the cave changed noticeably. I still visited regularly, but treatment gradually gave way to monitoring and guiding the final exercises. Each time I entered the cave, I saw more laughter, more relaxed moments, and more relieved eyes instead of the tension of the first weeks. The mother began preparing her seat before I arrived, while the two children always ran out to the cave entrance to meet me from far away. They no longer hid behind their father as they had before. Instead, the older child often helped carry my medical bag inside, and the younger one would run to bring stream water or clean leaves I used while changing the bandage. One morning, after checking the arm and confirming that everything was healing very well, I decided to guide the mother through simple daily tasks to assess how she could use the arm in normal activity. I pointed at a leaf bowl nearby and signaled for her to try picking it up, turning her wrist slightly and setting it down. The female Bigfoot moved very slowly, but every motion was steady. Then I picked up a small piece of wood and placed it in her hand. The mother held it for a few seconds, and then passed it to her other hand exactly as I had demonstrated. The movements were still not very flexible, but her grip strength had improved greatly. I smiled with satisfaction, while the male Bigfoot watched each movement carefully, as if trying to remember everything, so he could continue helping his wife when I was not there. What moved me most happened at the end of that visit. While I was packing up my tools, the male Bigfoot, I suddenly stood and signaled for the whole family to follow him. He stepped out into the open patch of ground in front of the cave, where rare autumn sunlight passed through the tall trees. Curious, I followed behind him. The mother also slowly came out with the two children. When he reached the middle of the clearing, the male Bigfoot bent down, picked up a fairly long dry branch, and used the tip to draw on the damp ground. At first, I did not understand what he was doing. Only when the lines gradually became clear did I fall silent. The first image showed 4 figures of different heights standing together. I easily recognized them as the Bigfoot family. Beside them was a smaller human figure with long hair drawn in simple lines. That figure stood facing the whole family. Between the two groups were curved lines that looked like arms reaching toward one another. The drawing was very simple, but enough for me to understand what the male Bigfoot wanted to say. I sat beside the drawing and looked up. The male Bigfoot stood still, his calm eyes turned toward me. The mother smiled softly, while the 2 young Bigfoots kept looking from the drawing to me with hopeful expectation. I had never imagined I would be given a drawing by a Bigfoot. He did not use paper and had no colored pencils. With only a branch and the ground before the cave, he had told the entire story of us in his own way. I reached out and accepted the branch from the male Bigfoot. After thinking for a few seconds, I bent down and drew one small shape above all 5 figures. It was a very simple heart. I was not good at drawing, but I hoped they would understand the meaning of that symbol. As soon as I set the branch down, the younger Bigfoot laughed and pointed at the heart with one finger. The older one looked at it for a long time before turning to hug its mother. The female Bigfoot gently placed her recovered hand on her chest, while the male Bigfoot looked at the drawing and slowly nodded. That moment made me realize that some things can be communicated fully without language. We came from 2 completely different worlds. We had never understood each other's words. Yet through patience, trust, and sincere actions over many weeks, both sides had found a way to communicate beyond every barrier. When I prepared to leave the cave, I looked back at the drawing still on the ground. Sunlight passed through the cedar branches and made the lines clearer. I silently hoped the rain would come very slowly, so the drawing could stay for a few more days as a beautiful memory of the time when a woman living alone in the forest and a Bigfoot family became special friends in each other's lives. The next morning, I stepped slowly onto the porch of my cabin. The cold air still covered the forest, but the first sunlight had begun cutting through the white snow-covered cedars. At the edge of the woods ahead, the entire Bigfoot family was still standing there. The two young Bigfoots saw me first. They immediately raised their arms high and waved in the exact motion I had taught them during our earlier meetings. I laughed and slowly raised my hand in return. The female Bigfoot stepped forward once. She placed the hand that had once been injured on her chest and bowed deeply. The male Bigfoot looked at me for a long time and nodded slightly. I understood it was the goodbye both sides had prepared for. After a few seconds of silence, the father turned and walked into the forest. The mother held the younger child's hand, while the older child ran after them, and looked back to wave at me one final time. 4 figures slowly blended into the mist between the ancient trees, until they disappeared completely from sight. I stood for a long time on the front step, feeling the cold wind brush my face while my heart stayed full of warmth. From the following spring onward, every time the first wildflowers bloomed around my cabin, a wreath made from the exact 4 kinds of flowers I had once taught the 2 Bigfoot children to recognize would appear at my door. I never told this story to anyone, because some of the most beautiful things can only truly exist when they are kept with gratitude instead of proof. Hello, everyone. It's me again, Victor, the host of Bigfoot Sasquatch Story. Before we end today's story, perhaps the thing that made me think the most was not the question of whether Bigfoot is real. Honestly, every person has the right to keep their own point of view. Some people will believe this was a real experience. Others will see it as a symbolic story. But to me, the greatest value of this story was never about proving the existence of a mysterious creature. The most memorable thing is the moment when a husband was willing to set aside every defensive instinct and kneel down to ask for help in order to save his mate. That is a very powerful image. We often think courage means facing danger, but sometimes courage is accepting the need to place trust in a stranger when there are no other choices left. The Bigfoot in this story did not come to Maggie because he was weak. He came to her because his love for his family was greater than his fear of humans. There is a beautiful saying I have always remembered. Compassion is a language that even the blind can see and the deaf can hear. After today's story, I want to add one small thought. Perhaps compassion is also a language that can cross the boundary between species. When kindness comes from the heart, it does not need translation. A look, a nod, or a hand offered at the right moment can be enough to change someone's fate. If this story gave you a little warmth, a little hope, or made you look at nature from a different angle, please take a few seconds to hit like for the video. That helps the channel a lot in bringing new stories to more people who love the Bigfoot genre. If this is your first time visiting Bigfoot Sasquatch Story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss new stories. Every week we bring you emotional, mysterious, and powerful journeys about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and strange things hidden in the wild forests of North America. And now, I want to leave you with a question before we say goodbye. If one rainy night, a creature the whole world considered a legend knocked on your door and begged you to save its family, what would you do? Would you open that door, or would you let fear decide for you? Thank you for staying with me until the final minutes of this story. I'm Victor, and I'll see you in the next video of Bigfoot Sasquatch Story. I wish you a truly peaceful day, and I hope that on your journey, you will always meet people willing to offer kindness, just like Maggie once did in the Olympic forest that year.